you all to the services this afternoon. If you have a Bible and care to follow along, we are going to look at Matthew chapter 7. We're going to attempt to cover the first 12 verses of Matthew 7, spending particular time on the first couple of verses. So don't get too nervous if we don't get past verse 2 in a hurry. The Bible is not a very well studied book, unfortunately. Bible knowledge in America is at an all-time low. This country was founded upon biblical principles by men who knew the Bible, and they knew it well. If you go back and you read old documents, you can find quickly that this government was formed by men who were concerned with God's Word. Every year they take a poll and they try to figure out what man knows about the Bible today, specifically Americans. And here are some of the results from the 2014 poll. Less than 50% could name the four Gospels. Of course, an audience like this knows that they are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Revelations. Just seeing who's still awake. God helps those who help themselves. Most thought that was a verse found in the Bible. And indeed it is not. 12% thought that Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. Over 50% thought that Sodom and Gomorrah were husband and wife. Many thought that Billy Graham preached the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe my favorite was one college student thought that Joshua, the son of Nun, was actually the son of a nun. Well, people just don't know anything about the Bible. And that causes a lot of trouble. I suppose we could say of all the issues that we have in our world today, all the sin that is so rampant in our society is a result of the lack of Bible knowledge. There was a time not very long ago that the most popular verses or passages in the Bible were Psalms 23 and John 3:16, for God so loved the world. But I think those two verses have been surpassed. A new favorite verse reigns supreme in America, and it is now Matthew 7, verse 1. Judge not, that ye be not judged. They love that verse. You can't tell me what to do. You can't say that what I'm doing is wrong. Jesus says, you can't judge me. And of course, that verse has been violently ripped out of its correct context. As you study the Bible, if you study the Bible, you will quickly learn that the context in which you find a passage is of utmost importance. Let me give you an example. If you are there in the book of Matthew, look ahead to, or look back rather, to the 6th chapter. Matthew 6, verse 19 says, lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth. And yet everybody in this building does that. We all have treasures in this earth. If you have a wallet and you have $1 in it, you've laid up a treasure. So what is it that he was teaching? What was Jesus trying to explain? Well, when we go a little further and we read the context, we understand what he is saying. He says, lay not up for yourselves treasures in the earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and thieves will not break through and steal. He was making a comparison between where our treasures should be. Our goal is not to gain as much as we can in this world, but rather to lay up our treasures in heaven. We have to understand the context to understand what the speaker is speaking about. And so in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, when he says, "Judge not that ye be not judged," is he saying, I never want anybody to judge anyone else? You know, even the people who will claim that, they won't live that way. If somebody will say to you, I can do whatever you want and you can't judge me, turn it on them. Just go up and punch them in the face. Take a gun and put it to their dog's head and kill their dog. And when they begin to complain, you say, you can't judge me. You know, everybody recognizes that. Nobody wants to live under those rules. A law, a land where there is no judgment, where there are no rules. So what in the world was Jesus talking about then when he says, judge not that ye be not judged? Well, keeping it in the context of what he is going to talk about in these next few verses, we will find out that he is talking about a particular kind of judgment. A judgment that is very rash, that is formed quickly, that is very hypocritical, as we will notice. He is not talking about any kind of judgment, but this very specific kind of judgment. There was a particular group of people that Jesus dealt with on a regular basis, and I'm going to turn to Luke chapter 18 and read to you there about these people. They were called the Pharisees. They were the religious people of the day. And they were world-class hypocrites and judges. Listen to this story over in Luke 18, beginning in verse 9. It says, "And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves, and they were righteous, and they despised others. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee, the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as the publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other, for everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted." The Pharisees, this group of people that were opposed to Christ in every way, they thought so much of themselves, and if you were not a Pharisee or one of their followers, they lumped you into another group and they had a title for you, and that title was sinners. There was a whole class of people to them. They were the Pharisees and everybody else was a sinner. And there in Luke 18, that guy makes a very harsh and a rash judgment. He looks at a man, not even knowing the man, and he immediately is able to judge everything about that guy. Truth be told, many of us are guilty of that very thing. We have heard all of our lives, you cannot judge a book by its cover. Yet that's exactly what we do. We see somebody and we come to a conclusion about who they are, what they're like, and we rashly judge. But there's always going to be a price to pay for a rash kind of judgment. I remember reading a story about a writer who wrote for a newspaper, and his editor had given him the assignment of going down to the South and writing an article about how lazy Southerners were. So this Northeast newspaper man travels down to the South, and he's looking for a story to write. He's driving down the road and he sees a man out in the field sitting in a lawn chair hoeing the weeds. And he thinks, this is perfect. This is just the story I need. Lazy Southerners. So he grabs his camera, he jumps out of his car, he runs over to take a picture of it. But as he gets closer, he notices this, that the man's pants legs are blowing in the wind. The man had no legs. So the story suddenly changed from how lazy Southerners were to how industrious this people were. It's so easy to judge people from afar. Then when we get up close, we see things aren't quite the way we thought they would. Judging rashly will cost you. It'll cost you nearly every time. You probably have heard the story about the guy that he owned a big company, and he went out into his warehouse where his employees were, and he saw an old boy, and he was just over leaning up against the wall, not doing any work. And the owner marches over to him and he said, "Hey," he said, "how much do you make a week?" The guy said, "I make $300 a week." The owner reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, ripped off $300 bills, gave it to him. He said, "Get out of here, I never want to see you again." The guy walked out. The owner went over to the manager. He said, "How long has that guy been working for us?" He said, "Well, he doesn't work here. But he just came by to pick up a package." Judge rashly, you judge quickly, it'll cost you. And chances are, it's going to cost you a whole lot more than $300. It might cost you a marriage. It might cost you a friendship. It might cost you a whole lot of things when you don't take time before you make a conclusion or come to a conclusion. So Jesus says, don't judge, because you yourself will be judged. Well, let's read verse 2. He says, "For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you." So let's think about this. If we can judge, when can we judge? Well, the Bible gives us a lot of examples of that. One found in 1 Corinthians 15. This is a rather horrible story, one of the worst in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. The Apostle Paul, of course, is the writer of the Corinthian letter, and he's writing to these brethren. In the first verse, he says this, 1 Corinthians 5:1. He says, "It's reported commonly that there is fornication among you. And such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, even the world isn't doing this," he says, "that one should have his own father's wife." Sends chills down your spine, isn't it? We make the assumption that it was a fellow stepmother, but he was having an affair. He was committing adultery with his own stepmother. And Paul says, the world wouldn't even do that. But it gets worse. Verse 2 says, "And you're puffed up, and have not rather mourned that he hath done this deed, that might be taken away from among you." He said, you know about it, and you've accepted this horrible sin into the Lord's church. Paul says this in verse 3. "For I verily am absent in the body, but present in the spirit, have judged already." He said, I don't even have to be over there in Corinth. I don't have to see it with my own eyes. I've heard about it, and I can already judge and tell you that is a sin. So Paul obviously thought that it was all right to make judgment. Further, let's go to Matthew 18. This is a teaching of Jesus, Matthew 18. We'll begin in the 15th verse. Jesus says, "Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone." And we say, Well, how can we do that, Jesus? You told us not to judge. No, that's not the kind of judgment that he was talking about. Here was an obvious sin that had been committed, and Jesus says, when you see that sin, go and confront your brother, bring it up to him. Of course, we don't need to read the rest of it, but it says, and if he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. And he goes on to give other steps on how to deal with somebody who has committed a sin. But the whole idea is, the only way we can confront somebody who has committed a sin is if we have the ability to judge that they have committed a sin. Going back to Matthew 7. Look at the 20th verse. Matthew 7:20, Jesus says, wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. That's in the very chapter that he says, don't judge a man. So obviously he wasn't saying that as a blanket statement. There is no judgment that is allowed, but we have to put it in its proper context. Because he says we can judge people by their fruits. And we all can and should do that today. That's how we judge one another, by our actions, by the things that we do. I don't know much about trees unless it's a fruit tree or a nut tree, and that fruit is growing, and then I can tell you what kind of tree it is. I know it's an apple tree because there's an apple hanging from that branch. I know it's a pecan tree because there's a pecan hanging from that branch. I know it's a Christian because of their fruit, because of the things that they are doing. We can judge in that way. So keep in mind, please, that when he says, judge not that you be not judged, that he is speaking very specifically about an incorrect type of judgment that these people often were guilty of. Well, the book of Esther, we'll not turn back and read the story, you know the story. But it's a good example of a man who judged and paid the price. Because judgment like they committed was like a boomerang. You know, you throw it out, but it comes right back to you. In the book of Esther, we read of this story about this man named Haman. And Haman wanted to get rid of the Jews. He hated the Jews. And so you remember how he builds these gallows to hang the Jew from, Mordecai. And he builds those gallows 75 feet tall. That's a long ways up there. How high do you need to get to hang a person? Well, through history, generally, you know, they'd hang them from a tree branch. All it had to be was just high enough to get their feet off of the ground. Why would you hang somebody from the gallows that are 75 feet tall? Well, the answer was obvious. He wanted to show everybody what he had accomplished. He wanted to make this man a spectacle. He wanted that dead body swinging in the wind up there over the city so everyone could see. As you know the story, who ends up getting hung on those gallows that are 75 feet up in the air? But Haman, the man who built them. He paid a price, threw out the boomerang, and it came back and it got him. Sometimes we judge rashly because we don't view ourselves properly. We don't have the ability to look into a mirror and see that we indeed maybe are guilty of this sin. And so we go out and we point our finger at others. Another Old Testament example of this, I think, that fits perfectly. And again, one you know well, so we won't turn back and read it. But the story of King David, who one day goes up on his palace rooftop and he looks down and he sees the beautiful Bathsheba bathing. He falls in lust with her. He takes her to be his wife. He kills her husband. And just a horrible, horrible, dark chapter in the life of King David. And along comes the prophet. The prophet comes up to David and he begins to tell him a story. He said, you know, there was a rich man and had a lot of sheep, a lot of herds. And He had a neighbor who was poor, only had one little ewe lamb. That ewe lamb was like a member of the family. It would come and eat at his table. I've always read that and thought, isn't that kind of strange? Who would ever let a lamb eat at their table? And then I consider Americans and I think about their dogs. And how many times have I been in people's house and the dog sat right there at the table and they ate the same food that we were eating? And that's how this lamb was to this family. It was like a member of the family. And the visitors passing by, and the rich man goes out and he takes the poor man's lamb and he kills it and he feeds his visitor. And David hears this story and he's furious. He wants to have the man killed. The prophet points his finger in the face of David and he said, David, you are the man. You're the one who did it. You have the palace and you killed Uriah and stole his wife Bathsheba. Then David wasn't so interested in killing the guilty party, was he? Because he was the guilty party. When you sin, I want to be the first in line to point my finger at you and tell you you're a sinner. Till suddenly I realize, uh-oh, I'm guilty of that sin. And then things are a little bit different, aren't they? It's all our perspective of where we are at. We need to realize that, hey, maybe one day we will need mercy. Listen to the passage found in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Galatians 6 and 1 says, Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Before we point our finger at somebody and really give them the hard time, maybe we ought to stop and think that, hey, that could be me one day. And I wonder how I would be treated. When somebody sins, oh, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed in the proper way. Judgment is necessary. I think that could be established through the verses we read and many others. But not the judgment that these individuals were guilty of. In verse 3, in Matthew 7, before I go to verse 3, let me add one last thing about the judgment. An individual who would say, whenever a sin is pointed out in their life, you can't judge me. They need to understand this, and we need to understand this. The judgment from man is one thing, but the judgment we all need to be concerned with is the judgment from God. All of us one day will stand before a very fair, loving God, and He will judge us upon our works that we have accomplished here. Matthew 7, verse 3 says, And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Jesus, we believe, had a sense of humor. We see it drawn out here. He paints a picture that you just have to laugh at. The word behold means to observe with scrutiny. In other words, if you are beholding something, you're looking closely at something. He's talking about the mote that is in the brother's eye. What is the mote? Well, the mote was a piece of chaff. If you've ever been out in the field, you've seen this. A little, and it had reference to the wheat chaff, the little fine dust that would fly around in the air and would get in your eye, and everybody's experienced it. Everybody's had dust in their eye. You can't see it. You could even look in a mirror and you can't see the dust in your eye, but you know it's there. And how do you know it's there? You can feel it. It might be a piece of dust, but it feels like a boulder in your eye, and you rub and rub that thing. But there's no way to see that unless I'm a doctor and I take a microscope and I pry your eye open, and then I can find that piece of dust. And that's what he's talking about here. I am examining you all so closely that I have a microscope on you, and I'm trying to find something wrong with you. Here's the problem, Jesus said. Why I am doing that, why I'm looking for a piece of dust in your eye, I have a timber sticking out of my head, coming out of my eye. I can't see that timber, but I can sure see the dust in your eye. Jesus says, we have a word for this. And the word is hypocritical, or hypocrisy. Listen to what he says in verse 4 and 5. He says, or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Hypocrisy was a problem in the early days, and it's a problem today. If the world lasts another 10,000 years, it's going to be a problem. Let me read to you Matthew 23. To see what Jesus thought about the hypocrites. We always consider Jesus as a very kind and loving man, and indeed he was. But he also saw things that disturbed him, and when he saw them, he became upset. And the thing that oftentimes pops to our mind is the day that he went into the temple and he overthrew the money changers' table. He was upset with those individuals. But as you read Matthew 23, I think it's safe to say that this is the angriest that we ever see Jesus in his language. Listen, Matthew 23, beginning in verse 23. He says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to have left the other undone. Verse 25. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! For you make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Verse 27. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! For you're like unto whitest sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but within are full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Verse 29. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, because ye build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous. As I read it, this is the angriest that Jesus gets when people are being hypocritical. I wonder if anybody here knows where that word comes from. Probably some of you all have studied this before. But it's a really interesting word study. And a lot of word studies are, but this one I think especially so. Back in the old days, and I mean the times of Christ and before, back during the heyday of the Greek and the Roman empires, they had a lot of theater, even as we have today. Now, if you go to a play today, if you were to go to the theater, you would notice that the actors on the stage would have makeup on to maybe make them look older, and maybe, you know, if it's a young person playing an older part, they may have on a gray wig, but they put on makeup and dress in a certain way to convey the character that they are playing. But back in those early days of theater, that's not what they did. Instead, they would have a stick, and on it there was a big mask, and they would hold that stick with the mask in front of them, and probably everybody has seen those masks hanging on the wall, and they would talk behind that mask, and that mask portrayed who they were. And that's where the word hypocrite came from. It had reference to a stage actor. It wasn't really even a bad word to begin with. But what it became known as was this: a person was two-faced. They had their face, but they held up another face in front of them. They were acting like somebody they were not. And it became a part of the common language. And Jesus picked up on it, and he said, people are acting like somebody they are not. They are two-faced. And it made Jesus furious. He hated the fact, especially with these Pharisees who acted all righteous and holy, but really they were two-faced. They were really someone else. Well, that's always going to be a problem. We act maybe like somebody we are not. And when we do that, we judge and we condemn our very selves. If I stood up here tonight and I preached against drinking strong drink, against alcohol, which I have many, many times. If I taught that tonight and then you heard tomorrow morning that I got a DWI last night, what would you think? Well, even if I hadn't taught that, you would still think that was a bad thing, but the fact that I was teaching against it would add even greater condemnation to me, wouldn't it? I would be condemning myself. I would be teaching against the very thing that I did. That's exactly who these Pharisees were. They were saying one thing and doing another. They became hypocritical in every aspect of their lives. The truth of the matter is that we all do act a little bit different depending on the audience that we're around. You ever thought about that? That's not always a bad thing. It can be, and it was in this case, but we act a little bit different, and we say different things. I read about the little boy who went outside one day to play, and he saw a rat. He picked up a stick, he ran over and began to beat that rat. Then he jumped up and down on it. Then he kicked the thing, and he finally killed the rat. He grabbed it up by the tail, and he was so happy he killed the rat. He ran into where his mother was in the living room, and he held up and he said, "Mom, looky here." He said, "I jumped on it and I hit it with a stick and I kicked it," and about that time he saw the preacher over in the corner. And he said, "And then the Lord called him home." We change our language sometimes, don't we, depending on who our audience is. But that's not the kind of thing we're talking about. That's not the Pharisees. They weren't just trying to be polite in polite company. No, they were living completely different lives than what they were teaching. Let me read to you the warning of the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 2. Romans 2, we'll read 3 verses here, 21, 22, and 23, written thousands of years ago, but you think about how applicable this is even to you and I today, especially to those who publicly teach. Romans 2:21. Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through the breaking of the law, dishonorest God. If we teach something, if we believe something, we need to stand firmly behind it. Can't teach one thing and then be two-faced, put the mask up and go live another. Jesus was adamant against hypocrisy. And then verse 6, he says, "Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye the pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again and rend you." Well, this is something that means something probably completely different to you and I than it did to a first century Jew. What do you think about when you read about a dog? Well, you think about the house pet that is common in America today. But that's not what the Jew thought about. You wouldn't allow a dog in your house. A dog was the most vile of creatures. It would be compared to what we would think of a rat today. It's something nasty and dirty. The Jews hated dogs. They certainly were not pets. They were an unclean animal. They were the scavengers. They were like the vultures on the highway. There was no need to ever have a dog around. That doesn't ring true to anybody in this building, does it? You know, when I was a kid, my mother always had dogs, and true story. Every day, I mean every day, she cooked chicken for the dogs. And our dogs never drank water. Well, I guess they did, but that wasn't what they got at mealtime. They got warm milk on the stove. Warm milk and cooked chicken every single night. And she would put the pans out on the back porch. And so, as you can imagine, we didn't have one dog, but every dog in the neighborhood we had. You go to a grocery store today, and what do you see? Well, you walk into the grocery store. First, you come to the produce, there you can get your bananas and peaches, and then you go around to the dairy, you can get your milk and your yogurt, and then you pick up your bread, and then you come to the aisle that has what? Dog food. Food for dogs sold in a human grocery store. Had a Jew, if we could transport a Jew to America today, the thing that they would be most surprised of is this. Not your automobile, not the fact that we put a man on the moon, but that we sell dog food in a grocery store. It'd be like feeding rats, having them as pets, sitting at your table. They couldn't understand. And so when Jesus says to them here, let's read the verse again, give not that which is holy unto the dogs. He wasn't talking about the pet that you have at your house. He was talking about the most vile creature that was known to the Jew. It was a terrible thing. And he is talking about God's word, and he is saying, don't waste it on the dogs or people who have no interest in it. Further, he makes a second comparison in that 6th verse. He says, don't cast your pearls before swine. The pearl, of course, is a very precious jewel. You wouldn't throw it out into where the hogs lived at and let the hogs walk upon it. This was a teaching of Jesus to these people. God's word is holy, it's precious. Don't waste it on the people who are not interested in it. Move on. He would use this example, or symbolically teach this. When you go into an area and you teach and they reject it, he said, pick up your foot, knock the dust of that city off of your foot, and you go on. Find people who are interested. This is a book that is not to be wasted on people who are like dogs and pigs who have and do not see the value in it. He says, keep on moving, because the dog, the pig, as he says here, they'll stomp on it, it will turn and rend you. Or in other words, the dog will turn and bite you. Go and take my word, he was telling them, to people who will be interested in it. Well, we'll read verses 7 through 11, and we'll not comment on them because I think we'll do that tomorrow. But he says, ask and it shall be given. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and him that knocketh it shall be opened. For what man is there of you whom if his son asks bread will give him a stone, or if he asks a fish he will give him a serpent? And then he says in verse 11, if ye then being evil know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your Father which is in heaven give good things to them that ask him? And I will point this one thing out about verse 11. When he says, if ye then being evil, he wasn't using it in the sense that we use evil today, but it meant you are, parents are imperfect, but still give good gifts to your children. Don't you think I, God, will give better gifts? And then verse 12, and we'll close with this. He says, therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. And that verse is a great verse. It's a verse everybody knows. It is referred to as the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. And if we could take that one verse, Matthew 7 and 12, and apply it in all of our lives, it would get rid of every trouble in the world, wouldn't it? There would be no two people in this world that would have trouble with one another if everybody treated everyone else just the way they wanted to be treated. That'll never happen all over the world. But it can happen in a small situation like the Lord's church. We can treat one another as Jesus treated us. We can esteem others better than ourselves. We can lift others up and humble ourselves. We don't exalt ourselves, but we need to humble ourselves. We need to love others the way that we want to be loved. We close with that. It's just some very simple teaching from Matthew chapter 7. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, my uncle would often say, you're not going to be lost. You're already lost. That's a bad position to be in. The doors to the Lord's church were open 2,000 years ago, and they haven't been closed since. God gave us his Son. He gave his Son because of our sins. His Son died a cruel death that our sins may be washed away. If you've not allowed the waters of baptism to wash away your sins, don't wait another day. Today may be your last. Won't you please join the Lord's church today? And maybe you are a Christian and have fallen back into sin and need the prayers of the church. If that be the case, we would certainly invite you to come as together we stand and sing our song of invitation.